Okay, our next realm is sub-Saharan Africa, or Africa south of the Sahara. And so we've covered North Africa, including these areas that are in the Sahara, kind of a transitional zone. And now we're going to be covering the rest of Africa. That part of that is south of the Sahara Desert, or sub-Saharan Africa. As a reminder, make sure you know the concepts, ideas, and terms from the chapter. I haven't really highlighted any here, but we will be talking about a number of them. Okay, this is a regional map of sub-Saharan Africa, and I wanted to include this African transition zone. And as we mentioned before, that you have a concentration of population along the Mediterranean in North Africa, and then kind of a gap of a sparsely populated area of the Sahara. Then that transitions into sub-Saharan Africa. Now this is a GIF that kind of shows you the always dry Sahara here, and then a seasonally dry zone in between the desert, and then finally there's tropical rainforests right in the middle. Now this zone here that's kind of in between the rainforest and the desert is an area called the Sahel. The Sahel is a wide grassland zone that is kind of the northern edge of sub-Saharan Africa. It is right along that transition zone between the Sahara Desert and the rest of the more tropical part of Africa. So make sure you understand what the Sahel is. It's a tropical grassland zone that is just that kind of the borders between the wetter, more tropical parts of Africa and the Sahara Desert. And this is a figure we looked at when we kind of left off with the previous chapter that includes this thing called the African Transition Zone. And this is kind of like pretty close to where the Sahel is. And so the Sahel is really a transitional zone between North Africa and sub-Saharan Africa. And along these lines, you have a split between along religious lines, where North Africa Islam is the dominant religion. That transitions as you go further south into sub-Saharan Africa, that have more of a colonial history with Europe, and thus have Christianity as a dominant religion, with one exception of Ethiopia, which has been a historically Christian for many years. And so there's one thing that we'll talk about is there are tensions in many countries between different ethnic groups because of the way that the country borders were created. They were created with nationalities or ethnic groups in mind, but then we also have splits along religious lines in many countries as well, including Nigeria and Côte d'Ivoire, or Ivory Coast. So in the introduction, let's cover a little bit about the physical parts of Africa. This is showing most of sub-Saharan Africa, the size in relation to the United States, as well as the latitude, that it is sub-Saharan Africa is mostly tropical. And then the very southern part of it extends a little bit into the mid-latitudes. We've talked about plate tectonics in the past, and we've talked about continental drift. So this is the African plate, and where Africa is now is really kind of what is in the middle of what was Pangaea. If you recall, Pangaea was back 200-something million years ago, when all of the continents were connected together into one supercontinent. And Africa, what is now Africa, is right at the heart of that. So what's happened over time is that other continents have kind of cleaved and split away from Africa. So while they're moving outward and creating, mountain ranges as they move along because of subduction, Africa has more forces that are pulling on it. So its physical geography is a little bit different than that of, say, North America or South America. So rather than having tectonic-based mountain ranges, it's a series of plateaus and basins. So plateaus are kind of just sort of elevated areas, and then basins are kind of lower elevation areas. And as it gets kind of pulled apart, parts of it drop lower and become basins, and part of it remain higher and remain as plateaus. And some of these, you could have very sharp edges along the plateaus. Think of plateaus like in the Arizona or Utah deserts, but in a more tropical environment. And in some places, you also have rift valleys. This is where the Earth's crust is actually being pulled apart as the forces of plate tectonics kind of pull on Africa as it's being kind of pulled apart. So for example, in the Red Sea zone, this is a rift between Africa and Saudi Arabia that has filled up with water and become part of the ocean. There's other rifts within Africa that cause depressions and then fill up with water, that then fill up with rainwater. So here's a closer look. We have a few basins or lower elevation areas where the water runs down into, and then intermixed with higher plateaus or higher elevation areas. And then we also have a series of rifts, especially along the eastern part of Africa. So this is what plateaus kind of look like, almost like a tropical Grand Canyon environment in some places. So you can see these are kind of really just stacks of lava that have built up over time. And then between those are lower basins between these higher plateaus. And erosion has kind of worn them down over time. And this is a kind of like, this kind of looks in some ways like the environment in the Grand Canyon, but greener because it's in a more tropical, wet environment. This is the East African Rift Valley. So as you can, with tectonic plates, you can have forces that are kind of pulling the Earth's crust apart. And so parts of Africa are really being kind of tugged at because of the movement of plate tectonics. And when that happens, parts of the crust can slip downward and create what's called a rift valley. So this is a lower rift valley in East Africa. This is an escarpment, kind of the edge of a plateau. So in some parts of Africa, you can rivers might run. You can have these very extreme waterfalls where the rivers will run and then fall down an escarpment into a lower elevation zone. So while you don't have chains of mountains in Africa, you do have high volcanic peaks. Africa, because of the pressures underneath it, as it's been kind of pulled apart, there's volcanoes that have emerged. And so you do have some high volcanic peaks. And you can tell it's high because actually there's snow on top. Here's another view of high volcanic peaks, snow, tropical warm environment in the foreground, but snow in the background. So let's take a look at a climate map here. We talked about North Africa having B or dry climates, and we also have A climates or tropical climates in the middle, including savannas and rainforests. And as we get further south, we get back into the B climates again, dry climates. We actually have C climates right along, move that in a little bit, right along parts of South Africa. It's getting far enough out of the tropics that it's a little bit more like California. So here's a view of kind of the general scheme of vegetation. You have desert in the Sahara, followed by a kind of an intermediate zone of savanna. This is what savanna looks like. They're more of tropical grassland. You have a band of rainforest along West Africa and into the interior. Another zone of savanna and a savanna mixed with forests. And then another the Namibian desert, kind of in the southern part of Africa. And then a little bit in South Africa that's a little bit more like California. It has a Mediterranean climate. So this is showing the distribution of tropical forests and savannas in the world. We looked at specifically the Amazon basin, and we also have tropical environments in Africa. Not quite as much rainforest, but a significant amount of rainforest surrounded by a savanna zone. And the last place we're going to see a lot more significant tropical rainforest will be in Southeast Asia in the future.